Imagine being 18 years old, dressed in a flame-colored wedding veil, thinking you're walking into a night of celebration, and instead being led into a room full of strangers, slaves, witnesses, and a silent physician waiting for you. You were told this was a tradition. You were never told you would be examined. You were never told your body would be documented. And you definitely were never told the ceremony would involve a wooden figure standing in the corner beneath a heavy cloth, a figure everyone in the room already knew the purpose of. In a few minutes, you'll understand why the cloth is there. In a few minutes, you'll understand why your mother cried while fixing your hair that morning. And in a few minutes, you'll realize your wedding night isn't about love at all. It's about verification. This isn't fiction. This was marriage in ancient Rome, a ritual so disturbing that Roman historians avoided describing it directly, and early Christians tried to wipe it from memory entirely. By the time that cloth is lifted, Livia will learn the truth behind the ceremony. Rome hoped the world would forget, and you will too. The year was 89 CE. The emperor ruled Rome with iron certainty, and 18-year-old Livia Tersa was about to discover that Roman marriage had two faces. The public one, saffron veils, scattered walnuts, cheerful songs, and the hidden one performed behind sealed doors in front of people who might one day be called to repeat every detail before a magistrate. What she was about to endure was a ritual so uncomfortable that ancient Roman historians avoided describing it directly, and one that Christian writers later attempted to wipe from memory entirely. Before we go any deeper into this story, if hidden horrors of the past fascinate you, subscribe to Grim History, hit the like button, and once you reach the moment that unsettles you most, tell me where you're watching from. Let's begin. Before this night, before the witnesses and the cloth-covered figure, the day had begun with beauty. Her wedding procession had been almost dreamlike. Livia wore the traditional flame-colored veil, the flammeum, marking her unmistakably as a bride. Her hair had been arranged at dawn, parted with a spearhead and woven into 6 braids secured with woolen ribbons. Every detail followed strict ancestral practice. At the temple, the sacrifice went smoothly. The priest had read favorable omens from the sheep's glistening entrails. Her father had recited the ancient formula that transferred her from his legal authority to her husband's, and she had spoken the words generations of brides had whispered before her: Ubi tu Gaius, ego Gaia. Where you are Gaius, I am Gaia. A vow announcing that she no longer belonged to herself. Her new husband, Marcus Petronius Rufus, a wealthy grain merchant 25 years older, had met her only 3 times before that day. Yet by law, the ceremony had already made her his, or rather, it had started the process. Because in Rome, the ritual in public was only the beginning. The truly binding moment waited at the end of the torch-lit procession through the city, inside a house she had never entered, surrounded by people she had not agreed to meet. The crowds lining the streets had sung the traditional festive verses, crude, explicit, deliberately embarrassing, meant to amuse the gods and keep evil spirits at bay. Young men shouted suggestions through the veil that made Livia's face burn with humiliation. Her mother had told her the songs were harmless, meant to protect her, but Livia had seen her mother's trembling hands while fixing her hair that morning. She had seen the tears her mother tried to hide, and she remembered the final warning whispered into her ear. Do not resist. Whatever they ask of you, do not resist. It only makes everything harder. By the time they reached the house of Marcus Petronius Rufus, the last traces of daylight were gone. The doorway had been decorated with wreaths of greenery and wool, 2 blazing torches marking it as a place where a marriage would be consummated according to ancestral law. The crowd singing grew louder. Someone hurled walnuts at her as a fertility blessing, the shells catching in the folds of her dress and scraping her skin. It felt more like ridicule than blessing. Marcus waited in the doorway, and behind him, Livia could make out movement. Too many silhouettes, far more people than she expected. Tradition required that her husband lift her over the threshold to avoid the omen of stumbling, but the gesture was older than that. It echoed a time when brides did not walk willingly into their husbands' homes at all. Once the door shut behind her, muffling the songs outside, Livia finally saw who had been waiting in the atrium. An elderly woman in ceremonial robes, the pronuba whose duty was to oversee every moment of the night, a priest of unclear affiliation. 3 female slaves holding basins and cloths, an older man with a leather pouch containing medical instruments, and in the corner, partly hidden beneath draped linen, a wooden structure nearly 4 feet tall. The Pranuba approached and clasped Livia's hands, her grip firm enough to prevent escape. "Welcome to your husband's house," she said. "The sacred rites must now be completed." Few people speak honestly about what Roman marriage truly was. It was not romantic, not sentimental, not a celebration of 2 souls. It was a transaction, a legal transfer of authority, witnessed and documented as carefully as the sale of farmland or livestock. Under the oldest Roman laws, a wife passed fully into her husband's control, placed in manu, literally in his hand. He held the same legal power over her that he held over his slaves, even the theoretical right to judge life and death. By the early imperial era, when Livia walked through that doorway, the laws had softened on the surface. Women could own property. Divorce was possible. Some aspects of paternal power had changed, but the foundation remained. Marriage transferred a woman from one man's legal control to another. And like all major transfers in Rome, this one required confirmation. Think of how Romans handled land sales. Witnesses observed. Rituals invoked divine approval. Boundaries were inspected and walked. Documents were sealed. Nothing was assumed. Everything was verified. Romans applied the same logic to marriage with one grim twist. The property being transferred was a human body, and that body's ability to produce legitimate heirs was the asset being purchased. So Roman law required both the bride's virginity and the consummation of the marriage to be verified before the union was considered complete. Not rumored, not assumed, verified. And the rituals designed to achieve that verification, the ones Livia was about to face, were ones that very few ancient writers dared to describe directly, because even in Rome, they were considered unspeakably intimate. Livia stood trembling beside the shrouded wooden figure, unaware that what happened next would be burned into her memory for the rest of her life. A ritual so disturbing that later generations would try desperately to pretend it had never existed at all. Roman law was uncomfortably clear on one point: a marriage did not exist, legally or socially, until the union was physically completed. And it was not enough for the husband and wife to simply say it had happened. There had to be confirmation, observation, and testimony. Without witnesses, the entire marriage could be challenged. Without verification of the bride's virginity, the legitimacy of future children could be questioned. For Rome, that uncertainty was unacceptable. So the Romans created rituals that fit perfectly within their legal worldview and feel disturbingly unimaginable to ours. The Pranuba tightened her grip on Livia's arm and guided her toward the veiled structure in the corner. Livia's heart hammered so loudly she could feel its rhythm in her throat. She sensed that whatever stood beneath that cloth would change everything about her life, her body, her beliefs. But there was no path backward now. "You must greet Mutinus Tutinus," the Pranuba murmured, her voice steady but her fingers firm. "You must seek his blessing before your husband may approach. The gods must witness your submission." Livia swallowed hard, her breath trembling. She had never heard of this god before, and she had no idea what greeting him truly meant. Her hands shook as she reached for the draped fabric. The witnesses leaned closer. Even the slaves stopped moving. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. When Livia pulled the cloth away, she understood why. Standing beneath the covering was a wooden figure, carved with uncomfortable anatomical accuracy into the shape of a phallic idol. But it was not a tiny charm, like the pendants children wore for luck. It was not a crude scare figure placed in gardens to ward off intruders. It was deliberate, intentionally proportioned, built for one purpose. And that purpose became terrifyingly clear the moment the Pranuba began to explain. Mutinus Tutinus was Rome's shadowy deity of initiation and fertility. Ancient authors mention him only briefly, and always with a sense of embarrassment, as if the very name felt indecent. Augustine, writing centuries later as Christianity tightened its grip on Rome, described the ritual with fury and disgust. Roman brides were required to sit upon the god's emblem before lying with their husbands, and they did so in front of witnesses. He condemned the practice, but he did not invent it. Other early Christian writers referenced the same rite, hinting that it was too shameful to describe openly. Arnobius claimed brides were made to straddle the symbol while their new spouses watched. Lactantius argued that speaking of it polluted the tongue. Even Varro, a pagan scholar centuries earlier, mentioned brides being presented to mutinous tutinous with phrasing that suggested physical contact, though he carefully avoided detail. Modern historians, uncomfortable with the implications, often downplayed the descriptions, suggesting perhaps brides only sat lightly on the statue's lap in some symbolic gesture. But the ancient language does not support this softer interpretation. Augustine used insider, a word meaning to settle onto, to mount. Arnobius's phrasing suggested penetration. Lactantius refused to describe the details at all, something unlikely if the act had been a mere symbolic touch. The official explanation, of course, was fertility. The unspoken purpose might have been something else. To break down resistance. To demonstrate submission before witnesses. To prepare a virgin bride for what the law required next. Livia stood frozen before the wooden god, the flickering lamplight throwing its grotesque silhouette across the wall. The pronuba moved behind her, adjusting her posture, arranging her body, guiding her without gentleness. The witnesses watched in absolute silence. Her husband watched. The physician waited behind them, hands clasped, prepared for what came next. And in that moment, Livia finally understood the meaning of her mother's trembling warning. The obscene street songs, the secrecy, the dread. She understood what being a Roman wife would truly demand. Technically, she could refuse, but refusal meant the marriage contract would collapse. She would return to her father's home not as an honorable bride, but as a discarded woman, damaged, untouchable, unmarriageable. She would disgrace her family. She would become a source of shame whispered about at dinner tables. Her life, as she knew it, would be over. So she did not refuse. When the ritual ended, slaves approached with warmed, scented water. They washed her carefully, murmuring prayers intended to purify her after her contact with the god. But the cleansing had a second purpose, a more practical one. It prepared her for the examination. The physician, who had been watching silently, now stepped forward, and Livia felt her stomach drop. This part too was not optional. In marriages involving wealth, lineage, or political standing, Roman brides underwent medical verification before the ceremony. A midwife or physician documented the bride's virginity. The records of that examination could later decide disputes about inheritance or legitimacy. The texts, preserved by Roman medical writers, cruel in their precision, leave no doubt about what the examination involved. That first examination, conducted earlier, established the starting point. It declared Livia untouched, an asset unaltered, as Roman law saw it. Now came the second examination. This one checked that the ritual with mutinous tutinous had been carried out, that the physical signs matched the earlier documentation, that she was, according to Roman logic, ready. Everything occurred with the witnesses present. Their statements could later be demanded in court if the marriage was ever challenged, and not one person in that room seemed to feel the slightest discomfort about what was being done to her. Modern readers recoil at these descriptions. What feels invasive, humiliating, and traumatic to us was, to Romans, simply a matter of legal procedure. The bride's comfort did not factor into the equation. Her emotions were as irrelevant as the feelings of a field being surveyed before sale. Property did not have feelings, property was transferred, and the procedures had to be followed. When the examination was finally complete, the pronuba led Livia toward the bedchamber, prepared for the consummation. The room was arranged exactly as tradition required. The bed was positioned so that it could be easily seen from the doorway, because that doorway, by custom, would remain open through the night. Oil lamps burned steadily, casting enough light for the pronuba to observe without interruption. Slaves waited nearby to assist afterward. Every part of the room felt staged, arranged, prepared for a ritual Livia could not escape. Marcus entered at last. He paused at the doorway, glanced